I've always believed that you can tell everything about a person's soul by the way they touch something precious. My vintage wedding gown wasn't just fabric. It was a $40,000 architectural masterpiece of hand-stitched Chantilly lace and heavy silk radzimir, preserved in a climate-controlled vault for 35 years. It held the scent of my mother's prayers and the echoes of a day when I promised to build an empire with a man who is now gone. When I brought it out for my son's fiancée, I wasn't just giving her a dress. I was giving her my blessing, my history, and a seat at a table she hadn't earned. But the moment she ran her manicured nail across the bodice, not with reverence, but with a sharp speculative flick, I felt a cold shiver settle in my marrow. It was the sound of something tearing before the scissors ever touched the silk. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm you didn't see on the radar. My son, a man whose heart has always been larger than his peripheral vision, looked at her with a pride that made my chest ache. He saw a beautiful woman embracing his heritage. I saw a girl looking at a canvas she intended to deface. She thanked me, of course. Her voice was like honey poured over gravel, sweet on the surface, but with an abrasive underside. She spoke of modernizing it, a word that usually serves as a polite euphemism for destruction. I told her the lace was delicate, that the structure was intentional. She smiled, a thin, rehearsed expression that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Don't worry, Mother. I know exactly what this is worth. In my 60 years, I have learned that when someone tells you they know the value of something, they are usually talking about the price, not the worth. There is a profound difference." For the next 3 weeks, she went silent. No updates on the fittings, no questions about the veil. My son mentioned she was spending hours at a high-end studio downtown. I maintained my composure. I moved through my garden, pruning the roses with the same precision I used to build my real estate firm. I watched. I waited. I didn't call to nag. That is a tactical error the young expect from the old. Instead, I cultivated a silence that acted as a mirror, reflecting her own growing arrogance back at her. Then came the afternoon of the final fitting. She invited me to the studio, her voice brimming with a manufactured excitement that felt like cheap tinsel. When I walked into that sterile, white-walled room, I didn't see my gown on the mannequin. I saw remnants. The $40,000 masterpiece had been gutted. The lace, the rare, irreplaceable French lace, had been haphazardly sheared away. But it wasn't the alteration that stopped my breath. It was what she had done with the scraps. She hadn't integrated them into a new design. She had used the sacred silk of my wedding train to create matching outfits for her 2 poodles. Little ruffled dog jackets, trimmed with the lace my mother had gone blind stitching. She stood there, holding one of the dogs, looking at me with a gaze that wasn't just disrespectful. It was a challenge. It was a declaration of war disguised as a cute whim. She wanted to see if the matriarch would break. She wanted to see if I would scream or cry or take back the remaining rags. She wanted a scene so she could play the victim to my son. But she forgot one thing. I am not a woman who reacts. I am a woman who orchestrates. I didn't gasp. I didn't even frown. I walked up to the dog, touched the silk on its back, my silk, and smiled the most terrifyingly calm smile she will ever see in her life. "It's fascinating," I whispered, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You've shown me exactly where you think you belong in this family, and I think it's only fair that I show you where you're actually going to end up." The room went cold, and for the first time, the smirk on her face faltered. She had cut my past into pieces, but she hadn't realized that by doing so, she had handed me the thread to unravel her entire future. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share to Old School Payback to see how the stitches begin to pull apart, so you don't miss a single move in this game. I watched her eyes flicker, A brief, frantic search for the anger she expected. She wanted a predator that roars, but she was facing a predator that breathes. To her, the dress was a trophy she had successfully defiled. To me, it was a diagnostic test. She had failed it with a breathtaking lack of foresight. As I stood in that white-walled studio, surrounded by the skeletal remains of my history, I realized she hadn't just insulted my past. She had underestimated my intelligence. That is the most expensive mistake a person can make. The dogs look coordinated, I said, my voice smooth and dry like fine linen. I didn't look at the butchered gown on the mannequin. I looked at her. I watched the way her hand tightened around the dog's ribcage. She was looking for a crack in my armor, a trembling lip, a sharp word she could report back to my son. I gave her nothing but a polite, distant curiosity. I thought it would be a statement for the ceremony. She replied, regaining her footing. She tossed her head back, her confidence returning as she mistook my restraint for defeat. Tradition is so heavy, don't you think? I wanted to lighten it up, give it some personality. Personality, I repeated softly. Yes, it certainly has that now. I left the studio without another word. I didn't need to stay. I had seen the inventory of her character. She was impulsive, she was cruel, and most importantly, she was sloppy. She assumed that because I was a woman of a certain age, my power was tied to the things I owned. She didn't understand that my power is tied to the things I know. When I got home, I didn't call my son to complain. That would be a reactive move. Instead, I went to my study and opened a heavy leather-bound ledger. In business, as in life, everything is a transaction. She had taken $40,000 worth of silk and lace and turned it into dog accessories. She had effectively spent my grace. Now, it was time to look at her debts. I began to make calls, not to friends, but to associates. I had spent decades building the city's skyline. I knew the architects, the lenders, and the socialites who whispered behind closed doors. Within 48 hours, I had a very clear picture of my son's beloved. She wasn't the daughter of a wealthy textile magnate from the coast, as she had claimed. She was a woman drowning in a sea of credit card debt, a consultant whose only client was her own vanity, and a social climber who had burned every bridge she'd ever crossed. The wedding was set for the following month at the estate, my estate. She wanted a gala. She wanted the elite to see her crowning moment. I decided right then that she would have her gala. I would give her the most perfectly curated, most expensive, most public stage she could ever dream of. I would be the doting mother-in-law. I would pay for the catering, the imported flowers, and the vintage champagne. I would ensure every influential person in the state was in attendance. I called her that evening. Dear, I said into the receiver, my tone warm enough to thaw a glacier. I've been thinking. You were right. My dress was too old-fashioned for a woman of your vision. To make it up to you, I want to host a unity brunch 2 weeks before the wedding. A small, intimate gathering for the true power players of the city, just so everyone can see the woman my son has chosen. I could hear her breath hitch. This was what she craved. Access. Oh, mother, she cooed. The mother tasting like vinegar in my ear. That would be wonderful. I'll bring the dogs, of course, in their little lace coats. Of course, I said, smiling at the empty room. The dogs are the centerpiece of the whole story, aren't they? As I hung up, I looked at the photograph of my late husband on my desk. He used to say that if you give a thief enough rope, they'll eventually try to braid it into a ladder. My son's fiancée was currently braiding with my wedding silk. She didn't realize that I was the one holding the other end of the rope. The brunch wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be an introduction. I was going to introduce her to the consequences of her own nature. The secret to a successful trap isn't the bait. It's the comfort of the environment. If the mouse feels the floorboards shaking, it won't enter the house. So for the next 10 days, I became her greatest ally. I played the role of the aging matriarch who had finally seen the light. I sent her orchids. I asked her for advice on the seating chart. I let her believe she had broken my spirit so thoroughly that I was now desperate for her approval. It is a dangerous thing to assume a woman is weak simply because she is quiet. Silence is a reservoir. My son was relieved. I'm so glad you two are finally clicking. Ma, he told me over dinner. He looked younger, the tension leaving his shoulders. He is a good man, but he has his father's eyes, the kind that only see the best in people until the worst is standing on their doorstep. I patted his hand, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was about to perform a necessary surgery on his life. It would hurt, but it would save him from a lifetime of infection. She's a very expressive young woman, I said, choosing my words with the precision of a jeweler. The brunch will be the perfect way to welcome her into our circle. I spent the next morning in my home office curating the guest list for the Unity brunch. I didn't invite her friends. I didn't invite the superficial crowd she frequented at the country club. Instead, I invited the people she owed. I invited the boutique owner from the city who had been chasing her for an $8,000 unpaid balance on bridal accessories. I invited the former business partner she had slandered and squeezed out of a boutique firm 3 years prior. And, most importantly, I invited a very specific appraiser, a man named Mr. Ward, who had appraised my original wedding gown for insurance purposes only 6 months ago. I also invited the local press, not the hard news, but the society columnists who live for the intersection of old money and new scandals. I told them I was making a landmark announcement regarding my estate and my son's future. They smelled the blood in the water before I even poured the tea. She called me 2 days before the event, her voice breathless. I heard the clarion is coming, and the bank directors? Mother, you're really going all out. You only get married for the first time once. I replied, I want everyone to see what you've done with the family legacy. It's unforgettable. I'm wearing the modernized gown, she bragged. Well, what's left of it? It's very avant-garde now. Very me? I'm sure it is, I said. That night, I sat in the dark of my solarium, watching the moon reflect off the koi pond. I thought about the $40,000 gown. I thought about the lace that had been in my family for generations. A gown is just fabric, but a legacy is a contract. She had broken the contract. She thought she was cutting up a dress, but she was actually cutting the safety net out from under her own life. The psychological profile of a social climber is predictable. They are so focused on the rung above them that they never check to see if the ladder is leaning against a burning building. She was so intoxicated by the prospect of my wealth and the status of my name that she couldn't see the architecture of the event I was building around her. I had spent my life building things that last, buildings, businesses, a family reputation. She spent her life building a facade out of other people's materials. The brunch was set for Sunday at noon. The catering was impeccable. Smoked salmon, vintage champagne, and delicate pastries. Everything was white. White linens, white roses, white porcelain. A blank canvas. I dressed in a sharp, midnight navy suit. No lace. No frills. I wanted to look like the executive I am. As I checked my reflection, I saw a woman who had survived the sharks of the real estate world for 40 years. This girl wasn't a shark. She was a goldfish who thought she was a piranha because she'd managed to nip a finger. I walked downstairs as the first cars began to pull up the long, gravel driveway. The trap was set. The guests were arriving. And my son's fiancée was about to walk into a room full of people who knew exactly who she was while wearing the evidence of her own entitlement. The air in the solarium was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. My guests moved with the practiced ease of people who don't need to look at price tags. They were the architects of the city's social fabric, and they were all looking for the same thing, the woman who had managed to secure the heir to the estate. She arrived 40 minutes late, a tactical move, or so she thought. She wanted to make an entrance, to ensure every eye was on her the moment she stepped through the French doors. She was wearing the remains of my gown. It was a tragedy in silk. She had turned the $40,000 masterpiece into a high-low cocktail dress that was far too short and far too tight. The hand-stitched lace had been crudely reapplied to the hem with what looked like industrial adhesive, and she had draped a stole made from the train around her shoulders. She looked like a child playing dress-up in a museum, but it was the poodles that drew the most whispers. She led them in on thin gold leashes, both dogs dressed in their ruffled lace jackets, the lace my mother had prayed over. "Mother!" she cried out, her voice projecting to the back of the room. She glided toward me, her smile a jagged line of triumph. Look at the reaction. Everyone is absolutely stunned. Stunned is exactly the word, dear, I said, my voice a calm anchor in the sea of murmurs. I didn't flinch as she leaned in to kiss my cheek. She smelled of expensive perfume and desperation. I turned her toward the crowd. "Everyone, I'd like to officially introduce the woman who has taken my family's most cherished heirloom and reimagined it. I've invited a few special guests today to celebrate her unique eye for value." I saw her eyes sweep the room. She spotted the boutique owner, Mrs. Gable, standing near the bar. Mrs. Gable didn't wave. She simply raised her glass, her eyes cold as flint. I saw the fiancée's throat move as she swallowed hard. Then her gaze landed on Mr. Ward, the appraiser, who was staring at the dogs with a look of professional horror. "Why is he here?" she whispered, her voice losing its honeyed edge. "Mr. Ward is an expert in preservation," I replied, my smile never wavering. "I thought he'd be fascinated to see how you've handled the insurance liability of the gown. After all, the policy I signed was for a museum-grade garment, not pet wear." The color began to drain from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a gray mask. She tried to pivot to pull my son away toward the garden, but I placed a firm, gentle hand on her arm, the grip of a woman who has spent 40 years closing deals. "Don't run off, Chloe," I said, using her name for the first time. It felt like a stone in my mouth. "The press is just arriving. They've been told this is a story about legacy. They're very interested in how the modern bride handles inherited wealth." A photographer from the Clarion snapped a photo of her, then a close-up of the poodles. The flash seemed to make her flinch. She was beginning to realize that the spotlight she had craved was actually a heat lamp, and she was starting to sweat. I watched as Mrs. Gable approached her, a predatory smile on her face. "Chloe, darling, I haven't seen you since you stopped answering my calls about that outstanding balance. I didn't realize you were spending your budget on custom dog lace. How extravagant." The murmur in the room shifted. It wasn't the sound of admiration anymore. It was the sound of a social circle closing its ranks. I stood back, a silent observer in my own home, watching the first threads of her carefully constructed identity start to snap. She looked at my son, pleading for intervention. But he was occupied. I had made sure he was cornered by the bank directors, who were casually discussing the importance of fiscal responsibility and prenuptial transparency in high-value estates. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in my son's eyes as he looked at his bride-to-be, then back at the dogs. The slow burn was working. She wasn't being attacked. She was being revealed. "The main event is about to begin in the dining room," I announced to the room. "I have a small presentation, a tribute to the new legacy Chloe is building." She looked at me then, and for a split second, she saw it. She saw the fire in my eyes. She realized she wasn't the guest of honor. She was the exhibit. The dining room was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and silver, a space where many of the city's most significant contracts had been signed over the last century. I had arranged the seating with surgical precision. My son was at the head, flanked by the bank directors. Chloe was directly across from me, the light from the chandelier catching the jagged, uneven lace on her shoulder. She looked small now, dwarfed by the history of the room. "Before we begin the main course," I said, standing slowly, my glass of sparkling water catching the light, "I wanted to share a brief visual history of the legacy that Chloe has so creatively adapted." The room went dark, and a high-definition projector hummed to life, casting a crisp image onto the far wall. It wasn't a photo of the wedding. It was a scanned copy of the original 1991 purchase certificate for the gown, followed by the 2026 appraisal report from Mr. Ward. "Many of you know I value transparency in business," I continued, my voice a low, steady hum. "And family is the ultimate business. This gown was valued at $40,000 as a historical garment. Its value today, in its current state, Mr. Ward." The appraiser cleared his throat in the shadows. "As a garment, it is now worth the price of the thread. The alterations have rendered the lace unsalvageable for any museum or collector. It is for all intents and purposes destroyed." I saw my son's fork pause halfway to his mouth. He looked at the screen, then at the poodles sitting in their little lace jackets near Chloe's feet. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his fiancée with love. He was looking at her with the bewildered expression of a man who realized he'd invited a vandal into his home. "But," I said, clicking the remote, "value is subjective. Chloe believes in modernizing things. So let's look at what else she has been modernizing." The next slide wasn't a dress. It was a series of public court filings, collections notices from 3 different luxury boutiques, a notice of intent to foreclose on a property she claimed to own, but which was actually a subleased apartment 3 months behind on rent. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply froze, her mouth slightly open, looking like a portrait of a secret being caught in a trap. "I found it curious," I whispered, leaning forward over the table, "that a woman who could afford to treat a $40,000 heirloom like a craft project would have so many unresolved clerical errors in her financial life. It made me realize that Chloe isn't just a bride. She's a visionary. She sees things not for what they are, but for what she can take from them." Mrs. Gable, the boutique owner, leaned in. "Is that my signature on that $8,000 invoice, Chloe? The one you told me was lost in the mail for 6 months while you were traveling in Europe?" Chloe finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. This is a violation of my privacy. You had no right to look into my personal affairs." "In this family," I replied, my eyes locking onto hers, "there is no such thing as privacy when you are spending my capital, social or financial. You used my name to open those lines of credit, didn't you? You told them you were joining the family and that the bills would be handled by the estate." I turned to my son. He looked older. The boyish wonder had finally evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard logic of the man I had raised him to be. He looked at the slide showing the forged signature on a credit application, a signature that attempted to mimic his own. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe didn't answer. She didn't have to. The evidence was glowing on the wall behind her, a digital ghost of every lie she'd told to claw her way to this table. She had cut up my dress to show me she could destroy my past. I had pulled up her ledger to show her I could erase her future. The main course arrived, a perfectly seared sea bass, but no one picked up a fork. The hunger in the room had shifted. They were all waiting for the final cut. In my years of business, I have learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to lose. Chloe had spent weeks being the loudest, her fashion, her dogs, her constant reimagining of my life. But as the slides of her financial indiscretions hummed against the mahogany walls, she became something I hadn't seen yet, silent. It wasn't a dignified silence. It was the silence of a structural collapse. My son sat as still as a statue. He looked at the forged signature on the screen, his own name penned in a hand that tried too hard to look like his. I could see the moment the veil lifted. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that every "I love you," every whispered plan for their future, had been a line item in a budget she couldn't afford. "I can explain," she finally stammered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She looked around the table, searching for an ally. She found none. The bank directors were looking at their watches. Mrs. Gable was typing something into her phone. The socialites were wearing expressions of practiced neutrality, the kind they say for a funeral of someone they didn't particularly like. "There is nothing to explain, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the quiet, dangerous weight of a closing door. "A signature is a promise. A dress is a history. You treated both like they were disposable. You thought that by cutting up my silk, you were showing me your power. You didn't realize you were just showing me your appetite." She stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the hardwood, a harsh, ugly sound that set my teeth on edge. "You trapped me. You brought me here to humiliate me in front of everyone because you're a bitter, old woman who can't handle change." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. "I brought you here to show you the mirror, dear. If you don't like what you see, that is hardly my fault. Change is inevitable. Consequences, however, are earned." She looked at my son, her eyes welling with tears that looked as manufactured as the lace on her dress. Tell her, this is insane. We're getting married in 3 weeks. The deposits are paid. The guests are flying in." My son finally looked up. His eyes weren't angry. They were empty. That is the most terrifying look a man can give a woman he once loved. "The deposits were paid with my mother's money. Chloe, the guests are coming to celebrate a union based on trust. I don't see any trust in this room. I just see scraps." He stood up, tucked his chair in with agonizing politeness, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. He didn't slam the door. He simply removed himself from the equation. The room remained hushed. Chloe stood there, shaking, the poodles whimpering at her feet. She looked at me, her face contorted with a hatred that was finally honest. "You think you won? I still have the ring. I still have the name. I'm not leaving this estate until I get what's mine." "What's yours?" I asked, tilting my head. "The ring was my grandmother's. It was given to a woman intended to be a wife, not a grifter. As for the name, you haven't signed the registry yet. And after today, I suspect the only place your name will be appearing is on a series of legal summons." I signaled to the staff. The projector clicked off. The lights came up, bright and unforgiving. "The brunch is over," I announced to my guests. "Thank you all for coming to witness the clarification of our family's future. There are gift bags in the foyer. They contain a small piece of authentic, uncut Chantilly lace. A reminder that some things are meant to be preserved, not modernized." As the guests filed out, whispering behind their hands, Chloe was left standing in the center of the room. She was wearing a ruined dress, holding 2 dogs in stolen lace, surrounded by the wreckage of a life she had tried to steal. She thought the dress was the story. She didn't realize it was just the prologue. Desperation has a specific scent. It's the smell of ozone before a lightning strike, sharp and frantic. As the last of the guests vanished into the afternoon sun, Chloe didn't collapse. She hardened. She stood in the center of my dining room, the poodles tugging at their gold leashes, her eyes darting around the architecture of the house as if she were calculating the scrap value of the crown molding. You think you've won because you showed some papers and embarrassed me? She hissed, her voice dropping the honeyed facade entirely. It was jagged now, a broken blade. I have months of text messages. I have photos. I have a ring that's worth more than your soul. If you try to put me out, I'll make sure the Clarion gets a story that ruins this legacy you're so obsessed with. I'll tell them you're abusive. I'll tell them you're controlling. I'll make sure your son never speaks to you again for what you did today. I sat back down at the head of the table. I picked up a linen napkin and smoothed it over my lap with the deliberate slowness of a woman who has all the time in the world. I didn't interrupt her. I let her exhaust her supply of threats. Silence is a vacuum. It pulls the truth out of people, whether they want to give it or not. Are you finished? I asked quietly when she finally stopped to breathe. I'm just getting started. She spat. No, Chloe, you're at the end of a very short, very frayed rope. You see, when I invited the bank directors and the boutique owners today, I wasn't just showing them your debts. I was showing them your pattern. In the eyes of the law, using a stolen identity or a forged signature to secure credit is called felony fraud. And using my name to bypass the security protocols of those boutiques, that's identity theft. I pulled a small, sleek tablet from the side table and slid it across the mahogany toward her. On the screen was a live feed from the security cameras at the estate's main gate. 2 black sedans were idling there. Those aren't more guests, I said. Those are the consequences of your modern lifestyle. I've already provided the district attorney with the original appraisal of the dress you destroyed, the forged credit applications, and the testimony from Mrs. Gable. You didn't just ruin a garment, Chloe. You committed a crime against an estate. In this state, that's a mandatory minimum. The bravado vanished. It didn't just fade. It evaporated, leaving a hollow, terrified girl in its place. She looked at the tablet, then at the dogs, then at the ruined silk she was wearing. She realized she was standing in a crime scene of her own making. You wouldn't, she whispered. My son, he wouldn't let you. My son is currently in the library with our family attorney, signing a restraining order and a formal affidavit regarding the forgery. I replied, he isn't a victim anymore, Chloe. He's a witness. I stood up and walked toward her. I am several inches shorter than she is, but as I stood before her, I felt like a mountain looking at a pebble. I reached out and gently unclipped the gold leashes from her hand. She was too numb to resist. The dogs are innocent, I said, handing the leashes to my housekeeper, who had appeared silently in the doorway. They will be returned to the breeder you bought them from on a line of credit that was never approved. As for the dress, I looked at the shredded hem, the adhesive-stained lace, the tragedy of the silk. You can keep it, I said. You'll need something to wear for your mugshot. It seems fitting that you should be photographed in the very thing that proved you weren't fit for this life. She looked at me then, and I saw the realization hit her like a physical blow. I hadn't just protected my son. I hadn't just saved my money. I had dismantled her entire existence with the same cold, calculated precision she had used to cut my lace. She had played a game of checkers against a woman who built the board. The officers are at the door. Chloe, I said, my voice as calm as a Sunday morning. I suggest you go quietly. The Clarion photographer is still in the driveway, and I'd hate for you to look uncoordinated in the morning edition. She turned, her heels clicking a hollow, desperate rhythm on the marble floor as she was led out. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to see the end. I had already written it. I walked back to the table, picked up a single shard of lace that had fallen during her outburst, and held it to the light. It was small, but it was pure. It was a remnant of a past that survived, while the woman who tried to destroy it was already becoming a footnote. The front door closed with a heavy, final thud that echoed through the high ceilings of the foyer. It wasn't the sound of a guest leaving. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing. From the window of my study, I watched the two black sedans pull away, their taillights fading into the twilight of the oak-lined drive. Chloe was in the back of one of them, still wearing the shredded remains of my $40,000 legacy. She had wanted to make a statement in that dress. As the handcuffs clicked shut over her lace-trimmed wrists, I suppose she finally did. The house returned to its natural state, a quiet, observant grace. My son was still in the library. I didn't go to him immediately. Silence is a necessary medicine after a surgery of the heart. He needed to sit with the weight of the bullet he had just dodged. He needed to understand that love without discernment is simply a debt waiting to be collected. I walked to the dining room, where the staff was already clearing the remains of the Unity brunch. The white roses were being gathered, the crystal polished, the crumbs of the sea base swept away. Within 20 minutes, there would be no physical evidence that a betrayal had ever occurred in this room. That is the hallmark of a true professional, the ability to sanitize a disaster until it looks like a design choice. I picked up the two ruffled dog jackets she had left behind. The lace, my mother's lace, was stained with adhesive and dirt from where the poodles had dragged it across the terrace. It was unsalvageable as a garment, but as a lesson, it was priceless. I didn't throw them away. I walked to the fireplace in the hearth room and laid them across the grate. In business, when a property is beyond repair, you perform a controlled demolition. You don't mourn the bricks. You prepare the ground for something stronger. I struck a match. The flame was small, a flickering orange tongue that tasted the air before it took hold of the silk. Silk burns quickly. It doesn't melt like the cheap synthetics Chloe usually wore. It crisps and vanishes into a fine, gray ash. I watched the $40,000 mistake turn into smoke, rising up the chimney and into the cold night air. It was the most satisfying transaction I had made in a decade. My son appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. He looked at the fire, then at me. There were no tears in his eyes, only a hard, new clarity. "The attorney says the forgery charges will stick," he said, his voice steady. "She used my digital signature for a $50,000 personal loan 3 weeks ago. I never would have looked if you hadn't shown me those slides, Ma." "I know," I said, not looking away from the embers. "That was the point. You see the beauty in things, son. I see the structure. Both are necessary, but the structure is what keeps the roof over your head." He walked over and stood beside me, the warmth of the fire reflecting on his face. "I'm sorry about the gown. I know what it meant to you." I turned to him, then placing a hand on his cheek. My skin was cool, my touch firm. The gown served its final purpose. It exposed a rot before it could bring down the whole house. I'd sacrifice 1,000 dresses to keep my son from being a footnote in a grifter's ledger. He nodded, a silent contract between us. The old way isn't about the things we keep in vaults. It's about the standards we refuse to lower. Tomorrow, the Clarion would run the photos. The city would whisper about the lace larceny for a week, and then they would move on to the next scandal. Chloe would become a cautionary tale whispered in the powder rooms of the country club, a girl who tried to cut her way into a family and only succeeded in cutting herself out of society. I am 60 years old. I have built skyscrapers, navigated recessions, and survived losses that would have broken a lesser woman. I don't seek out conflict, but I am an expert in finishing it. Chloe thought she was playing a game of modern wit against an old woman. She forgot that the only reason I am old is because I was smart enough to survive being young. The fire died down to a soft, glowing red. The house was still. The legacy was secure. I walked to my desk, opened my ledger, and drew a single clean line through Chloe's name. A debt settled. A story closed. A cut so clean There wasn't even any blood left to mop up. When you try to shred a woman's history, make sure she isn't the one holding the scissors. If you enjoyed this journey of calculated payback, hit the like button and subscribe to Old School Payback for more stories of quiet power and inevitable consequences. What would you have done if someone destroyed your family heirloom? Let me know in the comments below.